Hi, welcome to our character project video. My name is Ray Yo, and I have with me today a, good friend of mine, Brad. And both of us are involved in the character project research. And I just want to introduce a little bit about myself, and then Brad can have a chance to introduce himself and the project he's involved with. So, now, I am a theologian by training, and I'm involved in this character project through my time here as a visiting scholar. Yeah, and and the bulk of my research is focusing on the theology of character, the kind of significance that theology, and in particular, what the Christian faith um, contributes to this idea of character. So, well, before I go into more details, maybe I'll just give Brad an opportunity to introduce himself and some of the things he's working on.
Sure. Thanks, Ray. So I'm Brad Cokelet. I teach at the University of Miami. Um, and my undergrad degree was in math and religious studies. I'm a non-theist. I was raised in a more or less non-religious household. So I was extremely fascinated by religion. And so Ray and I are both part of this project, the character project. And one cool thing about it for me, was to get to meet Ray, who works on theology. And so we've had a lot of conversations about our two different perspectives on some similar issues. So um, we'll be talking about that throughout the whole video here. But I guess to start out with my research, as I come out of things from mainly the Western tradition of philosophy, that's my main primary training. And I'm interested in questions about what it takes for someone to live a good life, a flourishing, authentic life, achieving some kind of authenticity. Then I'm also interested in questions about what sort of ethical ideals or moral ideals we should aspire to embody in our lives. And in particular, I'm interested in our relationships with concrete people, our parent-child relations, friendship relations. I'm interested in those as domains where you could be ethical, you could treat someone in an ethically admirable way or not. Um,
Hmm.
and so for the character project, what I ended up working on and presenting at the conference where I met Ray is a paper. I'm interested in the idea of character. And so when philosophers talk about character, they can mean different things, but roughly I think of it as the kind of baggage. So we talk about people having baggage they bring to situations. We usually think of it in a bad way, but I'm thinking of, you just think of it, it could be good or bad. It's sort of your dispositions, your tendencies, your emotional state, your sort of aspects of your personality that you bring to situations and relationships when you interact with other people or you go through your daily life. And uh, I think thinking about character is really important, and developing good character is important for you to achieve a good life and achieve authenticity, but also to live up to an ethical ideal. And so my paper was about defending the claim, basically, that your dispositional character, so not just the way you're feeling at a time or the intentions you have at a time, but your actual dispositions to act across different times and places and contexts, those dispositions, those aspects of your personal character or personality can affect the value of the actions you perform. And so this is the tradition I'm in is broadly inspired by Aristotle. And so critics of that approach have argued your actions value is not affected by your character. So I think maybe you could be interested in character and people's personalities and what makes someone a good or a bad person or have good or bad character traits, but that's just totally separate from the actions. And so um, that's a really central debate in contemporary philosophy. And so that was my goal. And so I give a bunch of arguments. So I guess the easiest way to explain it as an example is that I appeal to examples involving parents and friends and people who are in substantive relationships. And I say that the basic idea is that the meaning of someone's action when they interact with you can change. The personal meaning it has for you can change depending on their dispositional character. And so roughly the idea is if someone's an extremely devoted friend, or an extremely devoted parent, they're really committed and they really have the sort of devotion or love for you, that is a dispositional feature of them. So whether or not someone's a devoted or loving parent, it's not settled by something we know about their feelings in one circumstance. We got to look at their dispositions and how they act in different environments, or they would act in different environments. And I think that the how we evaluate how valuable actions are can actually depend on whether they express or manifest that devotion. So I gave examples like um, if someone goes, a classic kind of caricature from our culture would be if a dad goes to a soccer game after work, and maybe while he's there, he really gets enthusiastic and he really cheers and he really wants his son to win. He's really glad he's supporting his son. But the fact is, if his friends had asked him to go out to a bar after work, he would have been like, oh, I would have definitely done that instead. So he doesn't actually have any kind of strong devotion to showing up to support his son. So his disposition is never to go do that kind of thing. And he doesn't think it's that valuable or important. He doesn't have those kind of suspicions. It just happens in this one circumstance. His buddies couldn't go out. He got off work early. He had nothing else to do. So he goes to the game. But while he's there, he sort of gets in a good mood and does what you'd like a good parent to do. But the point is, that doesn't make him a good parent. But the main thing I was focused on is the action's value. It means a lot less that he's there, and it doesn't have his showing up to the game and cheering on silence doesn't have the same value as it would if it was expressive of his actual character. And so that's the kind of main argument I gave in my paper. So I bring that up partially just to explain a specific part of my research, also because interestingly it relates to some of the stuff Ray's been working on. But so Ray, why don't you let us know a little about your project?
Yeah, thank you. So, like I kind of mentioned earlier, so my training is in Christian theology, and so my research, there are actually two main aspects to my research. So the first aspect is I explore what is the distinctive nature of Christian character formation. What is unique about this Christian character and the way that it is being formed? How is it different from other kinds of character formation? So this is the one main aspect. The other main aspect that I'm working on is on the theology of spiritual perception. So there is a long tradition within the Christian intellectual thought that there is a kind of special perception with regards to God that Christians and religious people have. And so my project here is kind of to update this theory of spiritual perception and kind of highlight its importance for Christian character formation. So these are the two main aspects. So I'll talk about each one in a little bit more detail. So the first aspect deals with the distinctive nature of Christian character. So the focus of my research here is trying to see what is at the unique core of Christian character and how is it different from religious or non-religious character formation that are of the non-Christian sort. So, um, so in my work, I try to uncover the way in which uh, Christian character is different from, let's say, Aristotelian moral formation. And one of the things I'm trying to highlight is that Christian character is not first and foremost aimed at being moral, but it's at being engaged in a relationship with God as Father. So such a relationship is profoundly meaningful, satisfying, and also life-changing, not unlike like a marriage relationship. So Christian moral character formation is kind of like an outflow of one's relational and emotional engagement with God as Father. And this relational and emotional engagement is at the heart of Christian character formation. And it's what fundamentally differentiates Christian character from its, let's say, its Aristotelian counterpart. So in Aristotelian moral formation, there is obviously no relational engagement with God as Father. That is at the heart of moral character formation. But this aspect is actually central to Christian formation. Hence, a person whose character is formed in a way that kind of bypasses this relational engagement with God as Father, it would not such a person would not be forming his or her character in a Christian way, nor would the resultant character be actually considered Christian. It will not be considered Christian character if you bypass this kind of relational engagement with God as Father. And this is an important point because Christian character formation is primarily not a program of moral self-cultivation like what you have in Aristotelian and Confucian moral formation, but it is primarily one of relational growth, devotional growth in the devotion and familiar intimacy and attachment towards God as Father. So there is a lot of interpersonal dynamics. There's a lot of interpersonal attachment and emotions that comes uh, with such a uniquely form of Christian character formation. So this research on Christian formation is like one half of the project that I'm working on. So like I said earlier, the other half that I'm working on is on the theory of spiritual perception. And so there's this idea within the Christian theological tradition that it is only through the presence of God within a person that one is able to perceive or experience God's goodness in a way that's not possible otherwise. So my work on this front is to develop this tradition of thought by bringing this aspect of Christian theology into conversation with contemporary research on the emotions and kind of drawing out its significance for Christian character formation. And the very broad proposal that I'm making is that spiritual perception is a form of emotional perception of value. But it is an emotional perception that is only made possible by the indwelling presence of God within a person. So the way that I've tried to unpack this spiritual form of emotional perception is by seeing it as somewhat analogous to sexual perception. So what I mean by this is that when a person develops a kind of sexual disposition, it allows that person to have a unique kind of sexual perception to perceive the goodness of someone of the opposite gender in a way that is not possible before. So it allows a person to perceive and appreciate the goodness of another person in a way that's not possible um, before. And and such a um, perception, such a perception actually gives rise to a whole new range of emotions, a whole new range of motivations, a whole new range of virtues that are romantic in nature. So it allows for things like romantic concern, romantic virtues, and also romantic motivations, and of course romantic perceptions. So in a lot of ways, I see spiritual perception as functioning in the same way. Um, that the reality of God within a person gives rise to a kind of spiritual disposition that allows a person to see God in a new way, to appreciate the God's goodness in a new way that's not possible before. And this disposition gives rise to a whole new range of emotions, a whole new range of motivations, and a whole new range of concerns for God that was not possible before. And also gives rise to a whole new range of possible virtues, new virtues, in the same way that a sexual disposition gives rise to a whole new range of romantic virtues. So Christian virtues are unique in this sense. They are kind of grounded in this new disposition within a person's heart that gives rise to a new range of psychological possibilities. And at its heart, what spiritual perception does is to help us relate to God as Father in a way that's not possible before. And because this filial relationship with God as Father is at the heart of Christian living and practice, so every other aspect of the Christian life actually flows from and is constituted by this foundational reality of having God as Father. And this includes the Christian moral and ethical formation. And all of these arises from the foundation of this phenomenon that I'm exploring, known as spiritual perception. So yeah, so that's the kind of gist of what I'm working at.
Okay, yeah, great, great. Thanks, Ray. No, I mean, and so when I met Ray and heard about his project, like I say, I was really interested and excited. And one of the things we got to talking is that we're both interested, I think, also in if you approach things from the way most contemporary analytic philosophers, which is what I am, do in a lot of most philosophy departments, at least in the United States, they sort of approach things in a non-religious way. Not all of them, but the majority. And so we were interested in talking about what's the difference between a theistic and a non-theistic approach to character in general. And so one set of questions I think are about sort of the ethical character or moral character, and how does the development of moral character and the nature of moral character look different on Ray's model? And what I really like about what Ray just described is his theistic model emphasizes this relationship with another person, God, rather than and that sort of fleshing out the way that relationship changes your character, your emotions, and the values you can perceive. And so we got to talking, how does that relationship change our understanding of good ethical character and its development? And if you contrast it with a view that doesn't endorse theism, what kind of questions does that raise? So that's one set of issues we've been interested in. And so I guess, I was thinking one way to think about this, if you think of Freud has a discussion of the Christian doctrine that you should love your neighbor as yourself in Civilization is Discontents. And Freud says, look, because he's not a theist, he says, this is totally unrealistic. You can't love your neighbor as yourself, everyone, because what if someone's evil or mean to you, your enemies? And so he says two things. One, you can't, it's just practically not possible for you to love everyone. And number two, he says you shouldn't, because he doesn't see any reason you should love, say, your enemies. He thinks you should just love, some people or maybe people close to you. And so I think that's a way of highlighting, questions about if you don't have this theistic conception, maybe it changes our conception of what the ethical ideal is, good character, and also whether we can achieve it. But then there's this other set of questions about sort of what it is to live a good life and a flourishing life. So that's the domain we're going to talk about right now. And so one aspect of that is often thought to be some notion of meaning. And so a lot of people, when I talk to them about philosophy or just people who don't do it for a living, they think that there's some sort of idea floating around. Theism provides a source of meaning that you won't have in a secular framework, and that's a kind of thing that I've taught philosophy of religion, and I get the sense that a lot of people that are sort of atheists or maybe they're really, especially people that are really strong atheists, Dawkins or Sam Harris, Dan Dennett, they sort of don't, my worry has always been they don't quite take that worry seriously enough about theism providing a source of meaning. So talking to Ray reminded me of this example I gave. And so I'm going to give you my example of what I've thought of maybe a way theism gives you a source of meaning. The interesting thing is we found out Ray can articulate the idea behind my example a lot better than I can. So my example was, if you were a parent, if you didn't know your parents, but you were adopted, and later in life you collect watches, you love watches, you're a big fan of, know all about them. And so you go to a rare watch store, antique store, and you find this watch that one of a kind, they're very rare, you're very excited. So it means a lot to you that you found this watch. It's connected to this project. It's a hobby, but it's important to you. You get a lot of satisfaction out of it. Maybe you hang out with your other watch collectors and the community, and so you're really excited. There's a lot of meaning, and then you flip over the back of the watch. And it's the weirdest thing. It has the name of the name that your father had, who you've never met because you're adopted. And maybe it's a very odd name, so it's kind of surprising. You're like, whoa, okay. And so on a lark, you ask the watch dealer, does he have information of the person who sold it? And he says, oh yes. And he says the name of the person in the back, which is also your father's name, gives you a phone number. You call it, and you connect with your dad. So now finding this watch has put you in contact with your father, who you didn't know about, or you knew he was where he was somewhere. But and then that might you can imagine that you could create a whole relationship with that person that would transform your life. So now finding the watch has this profound source of meaning. And so my thought was, if I'm a theist, a lot of the experiences they appeal to as giving meaning are things like maybe you visit the Grand Canyon and you experience the awe and the grandeur of the Grand Canyon, and you think, oh, I had a really meaningful experience. I mean, I'm an avid hiker and camper, so I would love to go to the Grand Canyon again,
Mm,
go see the Havasu Falls. It's amazing. Um, and you refresh there. You get a break from society. You get all these good things about going out, in the wilderness, and you might experience sublime feelings. I mean, so you have it's very valuable. Um, but then if you're a theist, when you're there, you may feel like you're appreciating the grandeur of something your father made. And so
mm,
I think it's like the watch case where like theists have a source of meaning there to taking in something like the Grand Canyon that just is totally unavailable to non-theists. It doesn't mean, and so I think a lot of people who write about this, they point out it's not like there's no meaning to say going to the Grand Canyon for a secularist.
mm.
True, but that doesn't belie the point that a theist, it seems like there's a whole different category of meaning. So that was my idea, and so Ray's now going to talk a little bit about he thought that I think he's sympathetic to that, but then he has actually a way of expanding on the idea of the meaning you get in a theistic context that I think is pretty interesting.
Yeah, so thank you, Brett. That's a really important point that you raise up, and I really appreciate that. And yeah, so there are two different things to differentiate here. First is just having meaning, any kind of meaning in life, and then the other aspect is having maximal meaning. Maximal meaning in the sense that a kind of meaning that leads to maximal human flourishing. So, so when we are talking about, you know, what is the role of religion and religious narrative in character formation, and also in bringing about human flourishing. So one of the ways that I go about thinking about this issue is to think about it in terms of, you know, um, whether religious narratives are kind of required for maximal human flourishing. Uh, and and I would be inclined to say yes, that religious narratives are required for maximal human flourishing because of the human condition that we find ourselves in, because of the deep social and existential issues that prevents maximal human flourishing. And there are certain kinds of religious narratives that addresses these sort of deep existential and social issues that prevents maximal human flourishing. And what are some of these issues? So these are existential issues like the reality of our finite lifespan, that we are all going to die at some point, and this poses a deep existential concern that it renders all things meaningless by our death. Meaningless in the sense that everything that we devote our life to, all our time and effort into, the meaning of which is going to be drastically reduced by the reality of our death. Doesn't mean that it renders it completely meaningless, but it does kind of reduce the satisfaction that we have in the things that we undertake, and the meaning that we perceive from it, from the reality that 100 years from now, no one's going to even remember uh, a single thing that I have done. So then the second issue is the reality of moral failure and the need for moral redemption. So all of us, like, well, most of us at some point of our life would have experienced some kind of moral failure, and many of us would have experienced serious moral failures. But the reality is that there is no real way for us to atone for those moral failures. There's nothing that I can do in the future that is going to atone for the serious moral failures that I've committed in the past. In this sense, yeah, there's some kind of need for moral atonement for the kind of moral failure that I've experienced, and profound religious narratives provides some kind of narrative about how that kind of moral atonement can be achieved. And the third kind of existential issues that relates to maximum human flourishing pertains to a sense of personal security and connectedness. I think that there is a deep-seated existential anxiety in most of us that we face, sorry, especially when we face profound suffering and existential challenges. And there's a deep-seated anxiety that we are in this universe alone by myself. I'm having to go through all of this profound suffering by myself, and there's really no one else with me uh, who is going through this experience with me, carrying it with me. And I think this reflects the need for personal security, relational connectedness, and the need for personal support and attachment. And religious narratives like the Christian faith posits someone who loves you deeply and is able to carry you in every situation of your life, who is concerned for you and is able to be intimately related to you and loyal to you in the midst of all these profound suffering and disappointment that you are going through. Now, there are a lot of people that kind of see this as a kind of psychological crutch, but I do not see it that way. I actually see it as a condition for maximal human flourishing. And simply experiencing the grandeur of the Grand Canyon or the amazement, the vastness of the universe does not give you that. It does not give you that interpersonal connection, and it doesn't satisfy that need for deep personal security and interpersonal connectedness, a kind of attachment. And I think profound religious narratives actually gives us that. And then the last uh, issue that a profound and satisfying religious narrative should provide is that it should provide a narrative that can help to dissolve some of the deep-seated conflicts and isolation in human communities. And I think, again, a religious narrative like the Christian faith that focuses so much on love and the forgiveness of what other people has done towards us and the willingness to forego vengeance, revenge, and hatred. A religious narrative like this goes a long way to help dissolving the deep-seated conflicts and isolation in human communities. Of course, there are a lot of people in the modern world that sees religion as a major contributor to some of the deep-seated conflicts and isolation in human communities. And I think to a certain extent that is right. But that's only because I think that not all religious narratives are created equal. There are some that are more profound, and there are some that goes further along to kind of resolve those conflicts than others. And also we have to consider that not everyone who claims to be religious is really practices all the tenets of the religious narrative in a consistent way. And I think that a profound and satisfying religious narrative, someone like the Christian faith, who have a deep emphasis on love, on forgiveness, on not seeking revenge, on not seeking vengeance, in a focus on taking the suffering of others onto oneself so that others can live. A religious narrative like this, when consistently practiced and sincerely practiced, can go a long way to dissolving some of the deepest conflicts and isolation that we have in our human society. So, um, so this is why I think that a good religious narrative, a profound religious narrative like the Christian faith, gives us um, all these elements that is, I think, essential to maximum human flourishing. And this is why I think religiosity has an important role to play in character, especially when we talk about character that promotes maximal human flourishing.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks, Ray. So yeah, I mean, so one thing there is, um, I was in my original example of the watch. I was saying, look, having an experience with nature's beauty. If you're a theist, um, you feel like you're literally being touched with your father's handiwork, and so that's part of contributes to your relationship with this father. And what you're bringing out is there are these other dimensions of having a relationship to the father that could be connecting up with other aspects of meaning. So it's connected to a larger narrative that might answer worries you have, existential worries, and so that's the way that, like, then when you're having an experience in nature, it's that the part of the meaning of that experience is it's connected to feeling like the experience of the Grand Canyon is part of a general phenomenon that's
Mhm.
helping you deal with your existential anxieties. And so I think that's where I think that's a really nice point to make. When I go to the Grand Canyon, I might have anxieties because people are difficult, and being in a society with other people provokes various emotions like envy and stress about where you stand, and there are lots of social emotions that are not necessarily fun. And you go out into nature, you get a break from that. And so, I mean, there are various ways you can make sense of the idea that, as a secularist, being out in nature can give you, get you outside of yourself, out of your head. You get away from some of your neuroses.
Mhm.
So it could be an escape from certain forms of anxiety. But I think the thing that's interesting about what you're saying is that it's connected to a way of dealing with these more fundamental anxieties about the fact that you're going to die. A desire to be comforted, a desire to have someone support you, but also this issue of dealing with your past wrongs and sort of atoning.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think to push that home, right? Like, I mean, you're probably thinking, especially about an example, if you did something wrong to someone and they're not around anymore, so you
Mhm.
can't. It looks like that would be a good case. So I think I think that there is a real sense in which that, and so I already thought this was my watch example, but now after talking to you, I really think, like, look, when I go to the Grand Canyon, I'm not a theist. I just don't think my experience there. I loved going there, and I think it's valuable. I think talk about why. I just don't think it's going to give me can connect up with that same kind of meaning. And I'm sympathetic to that. So a couple things. So first I envision some atheists or secularists. One response is to say, look, the stuff you're talking about, this desire for existential comfort, um, you just take some Prozac or something,
Mhm.
whatever, just, or maybe, and I think even more so, I think especially a lot of people I talk to who are atheist kind of academics, they sort of think, they're like, I don't really worry about that stuff. They're like, yeah, I went through a period in college where I was freaking out about the meaning of life or something. Nah, I just don't.
Mhm.
Moving on. They just
Mhm.
so they just report that for themselves psychologically, they're not that worried about it.
Mhm.
And so then they think, well, so why should I think I'm missing anything? And I think similarly, you could imagine someone saying, oh, well, I don't think I've done anything that morally wrong that I need to atone for. So you can get isolated cases um, like that. And so what that brings up is another issue that you and I have gone back and forth and learn that sort of has come up in our conversation is,
Mhm.
um, well, if you want to start thinking about what is going to contribute to human flourishing, you're thinking of a general concept.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's just like if you want to know what do people need for healthy gums, and you go to the dentist, dentists, when they go to dental school, they don't just learn about what needs to happen to make their gums stay healthy. So maybe they have really amazing constitution. They don't have to do as much
Mhm.
as everybody else.
Right.
But if you want a theory of what it is to have healthy gums, you need to think of like the average person and what kinds of things do you expect to happen? What kind of pathologies pop up? What kinds of good things happen? And how do we deal with that? And so similarly, if you want a theory of human flourishing and a good human life, you certainly want to be able to generalize. So you want some kind of general conception of the human condition, human nature, something along those lines in order to ground your thinking. And
Mhm.
so one thought is, look, there may be some people who don't care about existential worries. Whether that's good, bad, or indifferent, that's a good question. We do have to talk about it. But um, you might think these people are just anomalous, right? They're like the guy who has gums that are perfect, so he doesn't need it. So, but we want to know generally what people need for human flourishing. So, and so that's so yeah. I guess I'll throw it back to you and say a little bit more about. But I think that's kind of a nice point that I think shows that you have to talk about the general theory if you're going to want to argue that meaning, isn't these things you're talking about meaning, you just can't be just because you don't care about it. We can
Right.
toss all your points aside.
Mm. Right, right. Yeah, and I think you raised a very good point too. So we have to kind of find out. I mean, in order to even find out what good character is, we will actually have to know what is human nature and what exactly is the goal of human life and what exactly does human flourishing look like. Well, you might be very satisfied with a very decadent kind of life, but that may not be what human flourishing, the objective sense is. Yeah, so there's a need to before we can even talk about good character, yeah, there's a need to kind of figure out what exactly is human flourishing, what is the good, what's the goal of human life, and what exactly is human nature. So I think that part of figuring that out, as um, you have said, actually in a previous conversation that we have, that you have mentioned that part of figuring that out is actually through empirical studies on human nature, and this is where a lot of the psychological literature, the empirical psychological literature, actually has a role, a very important role to play in kind of figuring out what exactly is human nature, what is the good life, what is human flourishing, and I think I agree with that point. And going on that premise, I also think that a good case can be made that human nature has a religious orientation to it. This is especially so when we consider that the majority of people around the world, for most of human history, are religious to some extent. So there is clearly a need for some kind of religiosity for most people, some kind of relatedness to a transcendent reality. If this religiosity is really an intrinsic part of human nature, then it and then it may very well be that some kind of religiosity may be integral to good character, and it may be integral to human flourishing. Um, so if we think that there is a deep-seated religious orientation to human nature, then it may very well be that maximal human flourishing in the actual world, given our human condition, may require some kind of religious narrative, with a particular emotional and cognitive force that we embed ourselves in and exist in. And the interesting thing is that, the value of this religious narrative or good character is semi-independent of whether it is true or not. The religious narrative may not be true, but nevertheless, it might be integral for good character, given this is the way human nature is in the actual world.
Yeah, no, that's good. Right. So it's because this was fun comes from a previous back and forth, and I agree that you look empirically. When I did my undergrad degree in religious studies, that's one of the things I learned a lot about. Is, I mean, you're just amazed by all the different religions and how how widespread some sort. Because so even in countries that are largely secularizing, if you ask people like in the United States, are you spiritual? And like no one knows what that means, but people say yes, right? All these
Uh,
people who don't, they'll be like, I'm an atheist, but I'm spiritual, right? So I
right.
mean, I think that's even more evidence for you that look, lots of people are actually involved in serious religious practice, but there are all these other people who, even atheists, they still want to insist they're spiritual. Okay, I mean, so we don't know why exactly, but so it's some further, just kind of armchair evidence. And so one of the things I guess my thought is at this point, from a non-theistic, non-religious point of view, there's sort of a couple of questions, or strategies of kind of proceeding here. So one is to agree with what you're saying that maybe there's some sort of empirical fact of the matter that most people, and you might even think kind of the normal person or whatever, how we want to think about this, statistically normal or in some other sense a normal person feels a desire for meaning. And so I think this is where, in addition to just saying a religious impulse, saying a desire for the kinds of meaning you specified. I think that's a really nice way to begin thinking about it. And so, because you might, I think one strategy is just to say, oh, well, we can agree with that, but then we just define the religious impulse in this very thin way so that you could satisfy your religious impulse by doing what the secular people are doing, with no religion. And so that there's a way, like you kind of see that, I think, in a little bit of a way, like if in John Dewey wrote stuff about the common faith, Josiah Royce. So they're the pragmatists in America, that generation of American scientifically, naturalistically based philosophers, they wanted to make room for something like the religious impulse, but I think they thought they could sort of shear off some of the theistic or more supernatural aspects. So that is one strategy, but I think your stuff on meaning does a good job of showing that might be a little hard to do if what people are looking for is existential solace. They want to deal with atoning for sins to people who are dead. There's some of these things like, and then the other thing I just mentioned, too, is I read this book by James Cone back as an undergrad, Martin, Malcolm in America, which is an amazing book. And in there, one of the things that comes out is, at least the way I remember it, is that Martin Luther King is represented as having a crisis of faith in the project of trying to overcome racism. And at a certain point, he's been relying on all the help and working together with whites, and he's burned enough times where he thinks he's starting to lose his belief that this is worth doing. And then at that point, that's one of the points in his life, the way I remember, I have to reread it, but my memory is that's where his religious beliefs really came in to buttress his hope and gave him the psychological capacity to continue on in his struggle. So that's another. And so I think all that, and then the other aspects that you mentioned, things like that. So a deflated view would have to deal with that. And then the other way to go that I've sort of become interested in is to look at a religion like Buddhism. And so, of course, there's a debate: is it Buddhism a religion or a philosophy? I mean, sociologically, it's a religion, but one way of understanding Buddhism is that it's espousing a series of philosophic views, doesn't posit the existence of God. Sometimes it's, kind of agnostic about things or doesn't take a stance on things, but it certainly isn't a theistic religion. And it argues that a lot of the things we're talking about, your existential anxiety, maybe your tendency to hold people responsible, including yourself, in a really robust sense. These might all be premise on a basic false background belief we have that we're selves. And so we think of ourselves as people who persist or fill up time, and we think of ourselves in a way that's fundamentally mistaken, and that grounds a lot of the anxieties we have about our time coming to an end, or we're not around anymore. And similarly, our way of relating to other people, in a lot of people, we hold other people responsible. We blame them or resent what they do, and then we feel guilty ourselves. And the Buddhists, they say the nice side of things that's appealing is they think we should be a little less, harsh on holding people responsible. We should try to understand the causes of their behavior, and that might generate compassion for them rather than resentment. The more counterintuitive side is that it looks like, by this parity of reasoning, maybe you should have compassion for yourself and you shouldn't be feeling quite as guilty. And so there's a lot to talk about there, but I think that's another way to go, is that if naturalists and secularists want to respond to the challenge you're raising about meaning, I think that maybe the most promising way to go is to really argue that you might be right about common sense. You might be right about what it is like for most people. They may actually have this desire for meaning in all the senses you're talking about. And their ability to maintain their commitment to ethical ideals might be committed. They might need to have something to buttress their hope that, they're adding. But, and the alternative, might need to be, well, if you had a story about how these people are all systematically have a false belief, they're in the darkness about the nature of themselves and their world, and that's what's generating these desires. So, an earlier exchange I talked about, in a certain way you could think of, a Buddhist might say that your desires for meaning in these ways they're pathologies. And I think that's right. In a way, they sort of think, it's part of our we suffer and we're unhappy. And this is a big part of why is that we do something, we're bad, things are not good are going on, and that's part of the story.
Mhm.
um, but the solution to suffering and the way to overcome suffering is by seeing through the illusion of the
Mhm.
self, and in doing that you also will shed any kind of desire for meaning in the senses that you're talking about.
Mhm.
So yeah, I haven't read Sam Harris. I know Sam Harris has some new work where he's engaging with Buddhism and things. So I don't. It would be interesting to know whether or not I'll have to look into whether they've talked about any of this. But that's, um, one thing. And so I don't know if we have time. If you wanted to go, maybe you could say something about that, or I don't know how much time we've left. But I think those are just things that would be fun, for us to talk about
Yeah,
as we keep talking too. Yeah.
I think the part that you brought up about, especially about Buddhism, is really interesting. Um, Yeah, because what you are essentially saying is that all of these existential needs that we have, or is kind of seemingly deep-seated desire, they are not exactly an intrinsic part of human nature. They are more of like a pathology, human nature gone wrong. And then the way to overcome them is to kind of overcome this uh, path, this twistedness, this pathology. So, um, so I think that this is where maybe empirical research in psychology can play a major contributing role, is to kind of help us to figure out what exactly is intrinsic to human nature, what exactly is human nature, and what exactly is human flourishing. There are a lot of people that is optimistic about the potential of empirical research to give us that answer. I am slightly more skeptical, just because of how complex. I'm not even sure what kind of experiment or what kind of study can you actually come up with that can actually give us an answer on those issues. So I'm a little bit more skeptical, but I'm open to it, and I hope that advances in the empirical sciences, especially psychology, can give us a clearer and clearer picture of what exactly is human nature, what's intrinsic to human nature, what is pathology, what is intrinsic, and what exactly is the goal of human life. And for all our talk on character, one of the surprising things is that our grasp of human nature and human flourishing is still surprisingly unclear. Yeah, because there's a quite a big difference between, let's say, a religious conception of human flourishing and a non-religious conception of human flourishing. So,
Hmm.
what exactly is good character? Some people consider religious virtues to be vices, character vices, especially faith. They will consider faith a character
Hmm.
vice, whereas religious people will consider it one of the prime virtue. Is faith a virtue or a vice? Well, that largely depends on what is human nature and what's the goal of human life, and yeah, and how do we differentiate between which version of human flourishing is actually the right version. And it's hard to adjudicate, and the hope is that advances in the empirical sciences can give us a hint on which direction we should be leaning to, but I'm not that optimistic that it is actually able to do that.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I agree. Well, that might be a good note for us to close up on. I'm actually, I do some work with psychologists too, and the other group of people at the conference at the Character Project were psychologists, and I think
Mm.
that is one of the really fun things about getting together is you learn how different these disciplines are. We're in,
All right.
and we're in our own little columns on the ivory tower.
Mm-hmm.
And it is neat. I think it's one of the things. That's one of the interesting things too. Is like, as a philosopher, I meet a lot of the psychologists, and right. Let's say we want to study. Let's go to study a bunch of avid Buddhist meditators, and see what their degree of happiness is relevant relative to like some Christians. And so let's say, okay, we want people really devoted. Let's get like a bunch of Buddhist monks and a bunch of like Christian monks or something. You know, so you got to make all these decisions. Who are you going to study? And then you're like, are the monks really serious monks? Or are they just doing it? You know, what, so you got
Yeah,
to deal with all. Say you could deal with all that, then you got to figure out what's your measure. Like
right.
how in the world, how do you understand? And so as a philosopher, I'm like, look, okay, talk of flourishing, you know, we have to define what we mean. Do we mean, you know, pleasure? Do we mean, you know, people reporting that they feel satisfied? I mean, so, and so I think you're right that, and that's the interesting thing is that, you know, there's this big movement of theologians, philosophers, and psychologists getting together. And I think it's good because I think it's getting us all to see that we can try to tackle some of these bigger issues
Mm.
piecemeal, you know, here and there by being more aware of sort of the limitations. And we can't just jump into doing the big projects like what we're. I mean, that's. I think we'd love that. Like if someone could give us the empirical answer to what human nature is. But it's. I think it's exciting to see people talking about doing that as a
Mhm.
group and like at least you know putting those questions on the table. But I agree with you. I mean, it'll be surprising if there's anything convincing given as an answer to that. But at least certainly empirical science can feed in, right, and you know
Right.
add a lot to the debate.
Right.
So
Okay. Well, thank you, Brett,
yep,
for this time, and we hope that viewers, would have an enjoyable time, thinking about some of these issues that really fascinate us. And yeah, so if you want to keep this conversation going, I'm sure Brett and myself would be happy to kind of answer, um, some of the questions and carry on some of the further conversations that might come forth from this brief video that we have. Okay, so
all right.
with that, we shall bring this to an end. Thank you. Bye
See you
bye.
later.